The year is 1066. A Norman army has just crossed the English Channel. At its head rides William, Duke of Normandy, son of Robert the Magnificent, grandson of Richard the Good, great-great-great-grandson of a Norse raider named Hrolf, whom the French called Rollo, who had terrorized this same coastline with longships. Approximately 150 years earlier, William speaks French. He dresses like a French nobleman. He fights like a French knight, on horseback, in armor, with the cavalry tactics that Norman military culture had developed over 3 generations. He is, by every cultural marker available, a French nobleman. He is also the direct descendant of a Viking, and the army he commands, the Norman force that will defeat the Anglo-Saxon English at Hastings, kill King Harold, and fundamentally alter the trajectory of English history, contains within it the genetic and cultural legacy of Norse raiders. He wins. He becomes King of England. His descendants rule England for generations. And through England, through the marriages and alliances and political connections of the Norman nobility, the genetic and cultural legacy of a Norse raider who had arrived in France with nothing but a long ship and the will to take what he could, disperses across Europe, into the royal houses, into the nobility, into the genetic heritage of populations from Scotland to Sicily. The Vikings did not just raid history, they became it from the inside. To understand how the Norse dissolved into the cultures they had terrorized, you need to understand what those cultures had that the Norse wanted. Not treasure, not land, legitimacy. The Norse raiding model, arrive in long ships, take what you can, leave before the response organizes, was extraordinarily effective at generating wealth. It was terrible at generating stability. A raider cannot sleep soundly. A raider has enemies on every coast. A raider's children have no inheritance except the reputation of their father's violence, which is worth exactly as much as their father's continued capacity for violence. The Norse raiders who were paying attention, the ones who were not just extracting wealth but watching how the societies actually worked, saw something. Legitimacy was a technology. A king was not just a man with more warriors than anyone else. A king was a man whom other men recognized as having the right to rule, whose authority was accepted through a religious and legal framework. That framework was Christianity. In 9th century Europe, the church was the legitimacy infrastructure. To be a Christian king was to have the backing of an institution that connected you to a moral order larger than yourself, that connected you to other Christian rulers through networks of alliance, marriage, and shared identity. To be a pagan Norse raider was outside all of that, feared, respected perhaps, in the way you respect something dangerous, but never legitimate. The Norse who understood this made a calculation. The calculation that Hrolf, Rollo, made when he arrived in the Seine Valley in the early 10th century. The raid model had taken him as far as it could take him. To go further, he needed something different. He needed to become French. The Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, 911 AD. The Frankish king Charles the Simple sat across a negotiating table from Rollo. The deal was extraordinary. Charles gave Rollo the land around Rouen, the territory that would become Normandy, as a feudal grant. In exchange, Rollo accepted Christianity, swore fealty to the Frankish crown, and agreed to defend the Seine Valley against other Norse raiders. A Viking was being paid in land and legitimacy to stop other Vikings. The logic was perfect. From Charles's perspective, the most effective defense against Norse raids was a Norse defender. No Frankish army had successfully stopped the river raiders. A Norse lord with his own longships and warriors, with a personal stake in protecting his territory, was worth 10 Frankish armies. From Rollo's perspective, he had just received more land than any raid could have produced, land he could pass to his children. He converted. He married a Frankish noblewoman. He started learning French. His children grew up speaking French. His grandchildren were French, in language, in religion, in culture, while remaining, in political organization and military culture, something new. Norman, not Norse, not Frankish. The synthesis of Norse maritime expertise and expansionism with Frankish legitimacy and the feudal framework. The result was one of the most formidable forces the medieval world produced. Created by a raider who valued legitimacy over loot, Normandy was not a unique case. It was a template. The same pattern, Norse raiders settling, converting, intermarrying, assimilating culturally, played out across the world. In England, the Danelaw, territory ceded to Norse settlers in 878, became, within generations, an English territory, with a Norse origin nobility and a hybrid identity. The Norse settlers learned English, adopted Christianity, and intermarried. Within 50 years, the distinction between Dane and English was largely a matter of family names. The names remained. Norse place names like those ending in by, Thorpe, and Thwaite are the fossil record of this deep cultural assimilation. In Russia, the Varangian settlers who founded Novgorod and Kyiv under Rurik were, within 3 generations, entirely Slavic in their language and culture. The Rurik dynasty ruled Russia as Russians, speaking Slavic, practicing Orthodox Christianity, and organizing their army on Byzantine models rather than Norse tradition. In Sicily, Roger de Hauteville, a Norman knight and Norse descendant, conquered the island from the Arabs in the late 11th century, ruling as something unprecedented. He held court in 3 languages, Latin, Arabic, and Greek, drawing scholars from across the world. He became the most cosmopolitan ruler in the medieval world. The genetic legacy is even deeper. A 2020 study analyzed DNA from over 400 individuals, rewriting what geneticists thought they knew about Norse dispersal. Specific Norse genetic markers were found in populations with no written history of contact, suggesting a presence the historical record had simply not captured. The Norse did not just visit, they stayed. The written record focuses on battles, but genetics reveal a quieter, more permanent infiltration into local populations. A Norse man settles, marries a local woman, and has children who speak French. Their heritage becomes a grandfather's story rather than a lived identity. Those children weren't in the sagas, but they were in the DNA. Spread across populations from Iceland to the Black Sea, the invisible legacy. It is more numerous and more genetically present in the modern world than any raid or battle could have ever produced. Here is the part of the Norse assimilation story that the triumphant narrative of Norman achievement tends to skip over. The people who were there before. Normandy was not empty when Rollo arrived. It was a Frankish territory with Frankish farmers, communities, and families who had been there for generations. The Norse settlers did not arrive into a vacuum. They arrived into a populated landscape, and the population already there did not all benefit equally from the new arrangement. The Norse settlers who received land grants under the feudal system that emerged from the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte received land previously belonging to someone else. The displacement was not always violent, but it was real. The Frankish farmers who found themselves subject to new Norse origin lords were not asked whether they preferred the previous arrangement. The cultural assimilation that turned Norse settlers into French Normans was a process that also turned Frankish communities into Norman subjects. The synthesis was genuine. The Normans were not simply Norse wearing French clothing. They were something new. But the cost of making something new from the collision of 2 cultures is not evenly distributed. The Norse settlers moved up. The people already there adjusted to having them. And in England, the adjustment was more than cultural. It was dispossession. The Domesday Book of 1086 documents the replacement of the Anglo-Saxon nobility with almost surgical completeness. Land that had been held by English thanes in 1065 was held by Norman lords in 1086. Thousands of landholdings, systematically transferred, not because the Anglo-Saxon nobles had been individually killed, because they had lost a battle, and losing meant losing everything. The Norman synthesis produced extraordinary things. The most sophisticated administrative system, legal innovations, grand architectural achievements, all of it built on the foundation of a dispossession so thorough that the Anglo-Saxon nobility as a class ceased to exist within a generation. The Viking descendants built something lasting. They built it on someone else's ground. The people whose ground it had been are not in the sagas. They are in the Domesday Book, listed as previous holders, past tense. In 2017, A DNA ancestry company published an analysis of genetic heritage across the British Isles. It had been looking for the Norse signature. It found it everywhere. Not just in the north of England where the Danelaw had been. Not just in the Scottish Islands and the Irish coastal towns. Everywhere. In populations across the British Isles that had no written historical record of significant Norse contact. The researchers estimated that 6 to 10% of the genetic heritage of the modern British population traces to Norse sources. Between 4 and 6 million modern British citizens carrying the genetic legacy of the Viking Age in their DNA. Not knowing it. A Norse settler has children with a local woman. Those children have children. 1,100 years, 30 to 40 generations, and the genetic contribution has dispersed, diluted by each successive generation, but not disappeared, still measurable, still detectable. Somewhere in Britain right now, there are millions of people who carry the genetic legacy of a Norse raider who crossed the North Sea, who settled, who had children, who built something, not a saga, not a monument, a family that had families. Until one of them is reading about Vikings on their phone, carrying the answer to what happened to the Vikings in their DNA. The Vikings did not disappear, they dissolved, into the populations they had raided and settled and married into the languages they modified, the legal systems they influenced, and the genetic heritage they distributed across a continent. Rollo became Robert. His son became William. His great-great-great-grandson became William the Conqueror. William's genetic legacy dispersed across the English-speaking world through expansion of a country that had been made, in part, by a Viking. The longships stopped coming, but the people who had sailed them did not stop. They just stopped being recognizable. They became French. They became English. They became Russian. They became the medieval world's new nobility, not by staying Norse, by being willing to become whatever the next step required. The most Viking quality of all, looking at what is in front of you and figuring out how to use it.